Coming to you live around the world from NOV's Studio 202. This is Inside Out Horizons. With your hosts, Lydia Mabry, Jeremy Grzywa, Cass Casey, and Shelby Dumaine. Now, let's start the show.
Welcome to Inside Out Horizons. I'm today's host, Jeremy Grzywa. Today we have a really exciting topic. We're going to talk about carbon capture, and we're joined by Jeff Erikson from the Global CCS Institute. So Jeff, if you would, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the Institute, as we'll call them from here on forward.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. And it's a pleasure to join you and NOV today. Yes, my name is Jeff Erikson. I'm the General Manager for Client Engagement for the Global CCS Institute. What that means is that I have responsibility for our nearly 200 members that make up the Institute itself. The Institute is a global think tank. We have a singular mission, which is to advance deployment of carbon capture and storage globally. And our members include both governments from around the world, national and subnational governments, as well as the private sector. Most of our members actually are from the private sector. They include large multinational oil companies that are household names, but they also include a lot of really interesting smaller companies, including technology providers. And one of the things that's really fun about the work that I do is to be able to see this diversity of folks from all different kinds of organizations that are working at cracking the code on at least this aspect of the climate change challenge. So the technology providers, we continue to bring in more technology providers into our membership. They all have a little bit of a different take on their own work and some of the solutions that they're working at providing. And it's so much fun just to watch this creativity happen on a challenge that is a really serious and significant one for all of us.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a very quickly evolving space. So thank you for joining us. Excited to talk a little bit more about this. Before we really kick off the show, we want to say thank you for joining us. We are live, so if you have questions for Jeff, please drop them in the chat, and we'll save some time at the end of the show to go through those, and we'll have a bit of a Q&A then. But before we get to the Q&A, let's set a level playing field here. So let's talk about how carbon capture works and how it is, what role it plays in the climate change initiatives that are happening around the world. I think that would be a good kickoff question to set the playing field for the conversation today.
Sure. Yeah, and I think actually the words that we use, I think well describe at a very high level what carbon capture and storage is. There are generally three elements to a project. There's the capture piece, and typically that is a piece of kit that's attached to a flue stream at an industrial facility. That could be a power plant, could be a cement plant or a steel plant, an ethanol plant. And the intent of that kit is to separate the CO2 from the rest of the flue emissions, separate that, and then essentially put that into, compress it, dehydrate it, put it into a pipeline, and transport it to an area where the geology is appropriate for long-term, permanent, and secure storage. So there's about 5,500 miles currently of CO2 pipeline in the US. That needs to multiply by about 5 times as we start to build this out over the next few decades. But there's a substantial network that already exists for transporting CO2 from the place where it's captured to the place where it's stored. And we can get into that a bit more if you'd like. But when I talk about carbon capture and storage, or shorthand CCS, I typically am quite inclusive in my definition. So not only does it include point source capture, capturing emissions from a specific industrial facility, but also includes direct air capture. or carbon dioxide removal, which we're hearing quite a bit about. And that is essentially sucking the CO2 out of the ambient air, running that through a set of filters, concentrating it, and again, compressing it, perhaps putting it into a pipeline or perhaps storing it right there. So it includes a direct air capture element of it. It also, when I talk about CCS, it also includes permanent utilization. So that's sequestering the CO2 in products, not talking about carbonated drinks because that's temporary storage. And as soon as you pop the lid on the can, you're releasing that CO2. But I am talking about things like putting CO2 into cement and concrete, using it in aggregates, where we're talking about hundreds of years of permanent storage being where the CO2 is actually contained in products that we use on a day-to-day basis. So when I talk about CCS, I am quite inclusive about it, and there's lots of different applications for lots of different technologies. The process of storing the CO2 underground, a lot of misunderstandings about what that actually is. It's not a big underground open cavern or cave. The CO2 is actually stored in solid rock or seemingly solid rock that is porous and permeable, a bit like a sponge, where it's the CO2 is able to flow through that rock formation, and over time it attaches to the rock element, the solid rock elements of that, and over decades or perhaps centuries, it actually mineralizes in the subsurface. Now, will that have an impact on drinking water? The answer is no. Drinking water typically exists within tens or perhaps hundreds of feet of the surface. We're talking about, at a very minimum, a couple of kilometers or a couple of miles below the surface where the CO2 is injected, and there's separation from the water table by usually numerous impervious layers, cap layers, to prevent any upward migration of that CO2. So we've had decades of experience, about 50 years actually, of experience with securing CO2 in the subsurface. We know how it behaves. There continues to be a need for characterizing the behavior and the expected behavior of CO2 in any existing location. But both the science and the experience behind secure storage is well proven. And that actually is probably one of the smallest risks when you're talking about the risks of a CCS project.
So let's talk about the science and the technology a little bit then. So you just went through a wide range of different technologies that are utilized to achieve that storage and capture. What is the technological state of CCS, and what's needed to achieve a widespread adoption of carbon capture practices across a breadth of industries?
So I won't get into the specifics of any individual capture technology. That's not my forte. There's probably a lot of folks on this call that know more about that than I do. But I will talk in general terms about the state of technology and then what's required to get to scale. We've been separating CO2 from other gases for a century, right? We know how to separate CO2. NASA has used CO2 separation technologies in all of their space missions. That's to ensure that our astronauts stay healthy and alive. That's required. So we know how to separate CO2. We know how to separate CO2, and we have for a very long time how to separate it from industrial facilities. What's new is, I'll say, the price component and the efficiency component, and that continues to get better and better. And the applications that we're using the carbon capture technologies on continue to diversify. So in the early days of CCS, it was kind of founded in the oil industry. We were enhancing oil recovery using CO2 to kind of help support the migration of oil in the subsurface. It's called enhanced oil recovery, EOR. And in those early days, it was typically gas processing facilities or fertilizer plants where we were separating that CO2. through the industrial processes. Now, we've moved from there, and we're still separating CO2 from natural gas processing facilities and fertilizer plants, but we've now migrated into more difficult facilities with lower concentrations of CO2 in the flue stream, coal-fired power plants, gas-fired power plants, ethanol plants, which actually has to separate their CO2 as part of their industrial process anyway. So it's almost a pure stream of CO2. So the capture element there isn't particularly in addition to what's already existing there. Cement plants, steel plants, glass plants, those are all applications where CCS is going to be required if we're going to be able to meet the climate change ambitions that our governments have set out both collectively and individually. So lots of different types of technology. The technology continues to improve. The cost continues to come down from the capture side of things. Mm-hmm. And likewise, on the storage side of things, the technologies are focused on improving the way we both model the migration of CO2 in the subsurface and also identify where it's at, where it actually is, and kind of the monitoring and verification of where that CO2 is in the subsurface. So those technologies continue to improve, and consequently the costs then are coming down. So as we look at scaling CCS around the world on various industries, the low cost options are where the CO2 is already being separated as part of creating that process. Ethanol plants is the easiest kind of application of that to talk about. Power plants, both coal-fired and gas-fired power plants, are really critical application of CCS. Coal-fired power plants, not so much in the U.S., not so much in Europe, but in Southeast Asia, in China, in much of the developing world, they're going to be using coal and gas-fired power plants for a long time, and we need to capture those emissions. So the application is continuing to expand across different types of industrial facilities. And the challenge there is to match the technology with actually what's coming out of the flue stream to optimize that.
So you mentioned ethanol and some of these CO2 rich streams. I know ethanol plants are common here in the American Midwest. We have alum cycle power plants now that are burning fuel in an oxygen rich environment, producing a lot of CO2 in a more pure form. Where are you seeing this become the most economically viable, and where do you think it's going to take off first?
Well, I will say that from an industry standpoint, ethanol plants are probably the most cost effective from the capture or from the CCS perspective. So that industry, I think, will continue to take off. And there are two major pipeline networks that are being developed now across the middle of the U.S. And tens of or scores of ethanol plants that have plans to connect to those pipelines. So industry-wise, yep, ethanol plants you'll see a lot of growth in. Most of those ethanol plants are relatively small by volume. What's really interesting, and we're actually working on a report that looks at the decarbonization of four industries around the world: steel, cement, chemicals, and refining. And the size of the emissions coming out of the largest plants in the world, particularly in the steel industry and the cement industry, are enormous. There's top 10 list in the steel industry. I think 9 of them are in China, and 1 of them are in India. And the largest single emissions source from a steel plant in China is 60 million tons per year. Now, to put that into perspective, we're capturing about 50 million tons of CO2 per year across the 37 existing CCS facilities around the world. So if we're talking about the number of facilities, it's in the ethanol industry, but those are small volumes. If we're talking about volume, there's an enormous opportunity in the steel industry as well as the power sector. If we're looking geographically, the best place for the economics of CCS to work is right here in the US. And that's a result of 2 major bills that were passed over the last couple of years: the bipartisan infrastructure law, which had a lot of incentives and a lot of supports for capital investment in CCS, And then the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last summer has some enhancements in a section of the tax code called 45Q, which actually there's a direct pay option or reduction in taxes for the amount of CO2 that's being sequestered, stored in any given year. So the combination of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the 45Q tax credits through the Inflation Reduction Act, actually the combination make the United States the best place from an economical standpoint to invest in CCS anywhere in the world.
So what are you seeing outside of the US? How's the policy landscape developing across the world? The CCS markets obviously are a little bit different depending on the locations, the offtake options. So how is the policy supporting these types of operations globally?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very diverse, and
Hmm.
we're in this period now of policy innovation and policy exploration,
Hmm.
which is just really interesting to watch. And it's almost every country has a different approach. Canada has a national carbon tax that applies across numerous industries, and that's kind of a backstop for what individual provinces will do. In Europe, they take a very different approach. In the UK, in particular, a very different approach. Whereas in the US, we put these tax incentives out, the 45Q incentives out, kind of to the market, and let the market decide what to build and how to make best use of those tax incentives. In Europe, it's very much, in the UK in particular, it's very much more a partnership between the private sector and the public sector, where the government's much more involved in identifying where those hubs of or clusters of CCS emitters are, how to build a project around that. And then quite often, the approach in Europe in particular is to cover most, if not all, of the capital costs for those projects. Now, quite often that's done in kind of a competitive approach. And I'll just give you a little bit of insight as to kind of the downside of that. In Europe, there are they've just gone in. Sorry, in the UK, they've just gone through this competitive approach to getting the government to support the capital cost, covering the capital cost. And there are 4 projects that the government has committed to deploy by 2030. And there's been 50 to 60 applications for that funding, right? So 4 projects will be successful for this type of the funding. The other 56 will not. What happens to those plans where there's been a substantial amount of investment in developing CCS plans? What happens with those? And in addition to the capital funding, there's also the emissions trading scheme that also supports the economics of projects in Europe. But often not sufficient up on their own to get a CCS project across the line. In places like China and in Saudi Arabia, very much, the government is working with their state-owned enterprises to get CCS projects done, almost in the absence of an overarching policy or regulatory framework. And again, they're kind of exploring and creating policy as they go, if you will. So with just about every country, there is a policy and regulatory approach that's unique to their geography, unique to their politics, unique to their social situation, and unique to the economics and the industries that already exist in those countries. That said, everyone looks to the United States, and there's a lot of admiration for what the United States has been able to do through these 2 laws, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And they look to us, and there are a lot of companies that have indicated that they're redirecting their CCS investments to the US, because the economics work better here. So there's a bit of catch-up that's trying to happen around the world. Governments around the world are looking at the US as an example of something that's really driven interest and investment in CCS, and trying to figure out how they can utilize or adopt at least some elements of what we've done here.
That's fascinating. You mentioned projects, and I want to come back to that in a second. But listening to you describe this, it reminds me of the energy transition conversation as a whole. Different countries, when they come to the conference of parties and talk through their strategies and their nationally determined contributions as they progress towards Paris climate goals. Uh, each country is unique, and I think we see that across the board. We also see it within carbon capture and storage itself. But back to the projects, I'm curious, what does the project landscape look like in terms of scale, geography, location? Where you
Yeah.
And plants coming online? How soon are we going to start seeing facilities come online and see the numbers of CO2 captured start to ramp up?
Yep. So we have for many years tracked the development of CCS projects across their life cycle, from early development through advanced development into construction and operation and ultimately closure. And the IEA actually just earlier this year released a similar database with numbers that are fairly consistent. So I'm going to give you the numbers from our database, fairly consistent, but maybe some small differences between ours and what the IEA puts out. But generally speaking, there's about 250 projects that are in some phase of development or operation. Currently, 37 CCS projects that are in operation around the world. Nearly half of them are in North America. So, and most of those are in the U.S. About 100 in early development, about 100 in advanced development, a dozen or so, actually about 20 in construction, and as I said, 37 currently in operation. We are capturing cumulatively about 50 million tons of CO2 per year around the world. Now, that's all the good news. And by the way, the ramp up, the trajectory of new CCS projects that are in development, that trajectory is quite steep over the last couple of years. And again, it's driven in a lot of ways by policy, but also by net zero commitments that both governments and companies have made, as well as a recognition that addressing climate change is kind of, all the above options are required. So we're expecting continued growth in the industry around the world. Following, the U.S. again is the strongest example of that, but that's happening around the world. That's all great news. The bad news is that 50 million tons is only about 1% of where we need to be on an annual basis. So we need to scale up by 100x, more or less, to meet what the IEA says, the International Energy Agency says, is the appropriate level of decarbonization that utilizes CCS in ultimately a net zero world. So great momentum, but we've got a long ways to go, and that's going to require a lot of investment by governments from a policy perspective and by the private sector, not just for those projects that they know the economics pencil out, but in some early development, early R&D, as they do for other types of technologies. That's going to be required by the private sector as well.
Yeah. So how does the institute engage with these organizations, either corporate entities or governments, to help promote these types of projects or the investment in these technologies?
Yeah.
What are you doing on a daily basis to help push this forward?
We have three types of activities that we engage with, both for our members and for the general public. The first is advocacy. We're trying to build support for CCS. And that includes engaging with governments and the private sector to work on developing appropriate policies to raise awareness and understanding among not just decision makers, but also influencers and to some degree the general public. So that first pillar of what we do is advocacy. We're trying to build support. The second is intelligence. The second pillar of what we do is intelligence. We're trying to build knowledge around CCS. And we have an annual flagship report called the Global Status of CCS that comes out in November of each year, which is a great snapshot of what kind of where the industry is from a project, policy, and technology perspective. It's a great compendium. And then we do a lot of other thought leadership work throughout the year as well. That's kind of the knowledge building aspect of what we do. And then the third is is connections. We're trying to build community. So we're building support, we're building knowledge, and we're building community for CCS. And that includes a lot of our gatherings, both our public gatherings and those that are kind of members only gatherings. But it's that connectedness. And what's really fun to see is that a lot of our members, and frankly others that are in the industry, are forming these partnerships where they recognize that there's a common objective and different capabilities that the various entities will have, and they want to come together to partner to make them stronger together. So that's a part of what we do as well. I will say that we don't lobby. We're not a trade association. We don't advocate for specific bills that are in front of lawmakers, but it's at a more general approach. And we support the work of our members who often do engage directly on specific bills and legislation. So that's kind of where our role is. Again, we're advocating, we're building knowledge, and we're creating connections.
Great. So before we get to questions, for anyone who's watching, how do individuals or communities, how can they get involved in carbon capture, advocacy, or maybe outreach? What can an individual do to help promote these types of efforts?
Well, I think the advice I would give is follow the science. And there's actually a lot of misperceptions, misunderstandings, and bad information out there about what CCS is and what it isn't. And I'm quite confident that the science behind both the need for CCS and the safety and security of CCS, those are on the proponent's side, if you will. And so follow the science, read broadly from a various from a diverse set of resources. And I will point you to the Institute's website for as one of those sources. We actually have a document called Mythbusters, which is intended to address some of that misinformation or misunderstanding that's out there on CCS. So come to it with an open mind, follow the science, get educated. And the other request that I would have is try to avoid NIMBYism, right? Which is pretty prolific here in the U.S. NIMBY, not in my backyard. Everybody does it. We're all NIMBYists, as one of my colleagues recently said. But recognize that there is a need to address climate change on a broad perspective, and that's going to impact various communities, various companies in different ways. But avoid NIMBYism for its own sake. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. So I think now would be a great time to take some audience questions. And I believe, Shelby, we're going to link out to the website. So for folks interested in watching or engaging with the Institute's Mythbusters content, I think we're going to link that in the show notes as well. So Shelby, how about a question from the audience?
And that is correct, Jeremy. The document will be available in the comments here shortly. But we got this first question came from a Twitter user. They were wondering, we've talked a lot about CCS in the States, but can you talk a little bit about what's going on elsewhere in the world with CCS?
Sure, and I mentioned this a bit in the conversation earlier, but a couple of examples. Probably the most surprising and kind of under the radar country right now as far as CCS goes is China. You don't hear a lot about China, a lot about CCS in China as a Westerner. We just published a report in collaboration with a couple of Chinese entities, including a government agency there, which was just released recently, which demonstrates the breadth of activity that's occurring in CCS in China. Now, there's only a handful of operating facilities, or at least relatively large scale operating facilities. There's a ton of work that's getting done at the demonstration level, and China's overall approach is to spend the next several years proving out the viability of CCS across numerous industries. So not just power, but also cement and steel, as I mentioned, a couple of the major emitting industries in China. And then once those projects are identified or those applications in the various industries are viable, that's when they get to scale. So China is in early stages of policy development that's specific to CCS. But there's a lot of activity that's going on, again, kind of under the radar. Similarly, in the Middle East, we're seeing the same thing. Middle East, North Africa, we're seeing the same thing. There's a big project that the Saudi government just announced a couple of months ago called Jubail, which is going to capture about 9 million tons of CO2 from various facilities. And the UAE has been involved in CCS for several years. Actually, the first and only to date steel manufacturing plant with CCS exists in Abu Dhabi. So they've got a toehold in CCS, and they've got plans to continue to expand their use of CCS. And then we're seeing other countries in the region as well that are interested in deploying CCS. Oman, Qatar, Egypt have all expressed interest in getting on board and moving things forward. The other thing that's kind of under the radar is Brazil. The largest CCS facility in the world by annual volume captured is offshore Brazil. It's run by Petrobras, and they're capturing about 10 million tons of CO2. So a full 20% of the CO2 that we're capturing on a global basis from this one cluster of facilities offshore, a cluster of injection sites offshore in Brazil. They've got a robust ethanol industry, as you know, and there's interest in deploying CCS, particularly in ethanol there as well. So those are some of the areas that you may not hear so much about, but there's certainly activity going on there. And then Europe, Canada, US, lots of activity there as well.
What is the point source for that those facilities in Brazil?
It's actually an offshore oil platform. So they're using the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery.
Okay.
And it's gas processing from that facility.
Great. Shelby, do we have another audience question?
We sure do. We have an excellent question that comes from Jana Coit on LinkedIn. And she said, I saw that Robert Bottom submitted the first patent for carbon capture in 1930. Why do you think it has taken so long for CCUS to really gain traction?
That's a great question.
That is a great question. I think the answer is that companies will only invest in technology if there is a positive impact on their bottom line. And by the way, that impact can be direct or it can be indirect, but that's what it's going to take. And until with the development of enhanced oil recovery and techniques associated with that then allowed them to have some uplift on their existing oil fields. That created additional revenue. That was the business model there. As we moved into understanding that CCS could be a climate change mitigation technology, well, what's the business case for an industry to invest there? And by the way, the first CCS facility that was designed and built as exclusively a climate mitigation technology was offshore Norway. It's been operating successfully since 1996. So there is a couple of decades of history just with dedicated geologic storage. But governments, as they recognize that this is the lever they have to pull to meet their climate commitments, and as businesses recognize that decarbonizing their facilities and their operations, they can make the economics work on a project basis alone, but there's also a market share gain opportunity or market share defense need, if you will, opportunity to become a supplier of choice if you're providing your customers with low carbon products. There's a reputational aspect which impacts your ability to recruit and retain employees, engage in partnerships with others. So there are now this kind of set of incentives that are fairly recent because of the recognition of A, the severity and urgency to address climate change, and B, the policies now that are out there that will make the economics work.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I think you're seeing corporations take a bigger look at this. The sustainability reporting efforts that happen across many Fortune 500 companies today kind of outline some of those benefits that companies are trying to achieve, maybe not on the bottom line, but like you mentioned with recruiting, retaining talent, it's becoming a big focus. People want to make sure that they're seen on being on the right side of the climate change issue. So those companies that have a strategy and are perceived as being on the right side of history there will be the ones that reap those benefits. And I think there's economic benefits to be had as well. We see throughout a lot of the renewable energy technologies that as this infrastructure is built out, the inefficiencies in the market can kind of to clear up, and you start to see the bottom line impact once you have a established storage and transport network or established government policies that are going to allow companies to get these projects off the ground. So I think it's really positive signs for carbon capture moving forward, and it'll be exciting to see some of the developments take shape through the rest of this decade. So Shelby, I think we have time for one more question, and then we will wrap things up.
Absolutely. And I got one more question for you. Jeff, this question's for you, Jeff. It came from YouTube. The user is wondering, what area of CCS are you personally most excited about?
I really want to see deployment at scale. I've been kicking around working on climate change solutions for 25 years, and we're way behind where we need to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I see deployment at scale of CCS as a real need to address that challenge. And as I said, there is now a business case which continues to strengthen to make it viable for companies to invest. So the aspect, if you will, of CCS that I find most compelling, keeps me in the game, is the opportunity, the need to deploy at scale. Look, I'm a civil engineer, so I'm not a mechanical or a chemical engineer, so I'm less excited about the capture technology pieces. The storage piece is more my thing, and I can kind of relate to that, and that is really interesting to me, just kind of I'll call it the geophysics of that. So from a personal standpoint, an intellectual standpoint, that interests me. But I'm doing this because I really want to see this advance to get to scale, to have a significant impact on how we're dealing with climate change.
Fantastic. Well, I think it's certainly greener pastures ahead, and we thank you for all the work that you're doing in this space, and really fantastic conversation today. So thanks for being on the show. For those of you who'd like to see more content, you can go to NAV.com/live. And like we mentioned before, we're going to drop some links in the show notes for you today so that you can learn more about carbon capture, what the Institute is doing, and how you can pitch in and play a role in the energy transition. So thanks for joining us today, and we will see you next time.